In this video, I'll be talking about Foucault's political ideas taken from his lectures between 1975 and 76, and they are collected in this book called Society Must Be Defended. Some of the main ideas covered in his lecture theories include the relationship between knowledge and power, war as the foundation of all power and political discourse, the idea of biopolitics and how it created racism. And on top of that, he also discusses how these ideas are at play in French history. However, I personally know next to nothing about French history, so I will try to stay away from discussing that part in detail. He begins the lectures by discussing the idea of subjugated knowledge. When I say subjugated knowledges, I mean two things. On the one hand, I am referring to historical contents that have been buried or masked in functional coherences or formal systemizations. They are blocks of historical knowledges that were present in the functional and systematic ensembles, but which were masked, and the critique was able to reveal their existence by using, obviously enough, the tools of scholarship. I am also referring to a whole series of knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchically inferior knowledges, knowledges that are below the required level of erudition or scientificity. The concept of genealogy is introduced as thus. If you like, we can give the name genealogy to this coupling together of scholarly erudition and local memories, which allows us to constitute a historical knowledge of struggles and to make use of that knowledge in contemporary tactics. It is an insurrection against the centralizing power effects that are bound up with the institutionalization and workings of any scientific discourse organized in society such as ours. That this institutionalization of scientific discourse is embodied in a university or, in general terms, a pedagogical apparatus. Genealogy has to fight the power effects characteristic of any discourse that is regarded as scientific. He is essentially saying that in our societies we have institutions, usually universities or other governmental institutions of knowledge, which attempt to establish different disciplines of knowledge and make these disciplines scientific, such as ascribing to them standard methods of producing information. Once these disciplines are standardized, any production of knowledge outside the sphere is deemed as unscientific, and hence they're subjugated, given a lower status. The genealogical method is the excavation of the subjugated knowledge. It is a method which directs suspicion and critique to the dominant discourse of scientific knowledge. Indeed, the university has a selective role. It selects knowledges. Its role is to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative levels of knowledge and to distribute knowledges accordingly. Its role is to homogenize knowledges by establishing a sort of scientific community with a recognized status. Now, we must first understand the contexts in which Foucault is making his claims about power. So starting from the famous political philosophers such as Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, from the 17th century, the theory of social contract has been viewed as the most standard way of understanding sovereignty. In fact, even today in my political philosophy class at Cambridge, it is still the dominant theory that is studied. It is almost a default way of understanding how the state acquires its power. Under social contract theory, the state's power is objectified. This is because power is interpreted as something that the state acquires from the people, who willingly give up their power of control over various aspects of their lives in exchange for security. So, in essence, power is an object that is traded between the state and the people. It is exactly this sort of objectification that Foucault is speaking against when he says, power is not something that is given, exchanged, or taken back, that it is something that is exercised and that it exists only in action. Power is essentially that which represses. Power is that which represses nature, instinct, a class, or individuals. The most famous quote that Foucault gives about the idea of power is that power is war, the continuation of war by other means. This is an explicit inversion of Karl von Clausewitz's idea that war is the continuation of policy or politics. So basically, Foucault says, first, that power relations as they function in a society like ours are essentially anchored in a certain relationship of force that was established in and through war at a given historical moment. Political power is perpetually to use a sort of silent war to reinscribe that relationship of force, and to reinscribe it in institutions, economic inequalities, language, and even the bodies of individuals. so I shall briefly explain his ideas here. It is actually quite similar to Hobbes's ideas of the belligerent, warring state of nature. Hobbes believes that power relations are always shaped by expectations of conflict. For example, I will not attack you because I expect a bad counterattack. Or that I am always alert and I attacked you in premeditation of your attack. So in Hobbesian theory, the prospect of physical conflict is a hypothetical one that drives people to establish certain appropriate sorts of power relationships with each other. Foucault applies the same basic logic, but in his theory, war is actual rather than hypothetical. So there will be war first, and then power relations get established. As he says that power relations are always anchored in some relationship of force established at a certain time. That time would be one of physical conflict or war. What established relationships of power does is to reinforce that specific power dynamic established via some war into the daily functionings of a society or in between two societies. This is what Foucault sees as the reality of power. What the social contract theory does is to mask this reality. The essential role of the theory of rights has been to establish the legitimacy of power. So the main function of the discourse of right is to dissolve the element of domination in power and to replace that domination, which has to be reduced or masked, with two things: the legitimate right of the sovereign on the one hand, and the legal obligation to obey on the other. Foucault believes that talking about history in an institutionalized manner serves a twofold purpose. So firstly, there's the genealogical function. The genealogical axis spoke of the antiquity of kingdoms, brought great ancestors back to life, and rediscovered the heroes who founded empires and dynasties. The goal of this genealogical task was to ensure that the greatness of the events or men of the past could guarantee the value of the present and transform its pettiness and mundanity into something equally heroic and equally legitimate. So they must proclaim right to be something ancient, it must demonstrate the uninterrupted nature of the right of the sovereign and, therefore, the ineradicable force that he still possesses in the present day. Genealogy must finally also magnify the name of kings and princes with all the fame that went before them. They transmit their luster to the pettiness of their successors. Secondly, we also have the memorialization function. It shows that what sovereigns and kings do is never pointless, futile, or petty, and never unworthy of being narrated. Everything they do can be, and deserves to be, spoken of and must be remembered in perpetuity. So this is why when Rome collapsed, all the states in Europe are claiming to be the successor of Rome. They're claiming to be descended from that ancient empire. This connection to some glorious antiquity can heighten the state's sense of legitimacy and lift the actions of current sovereigns to the level of grandeur experienced by Roman emperors. In the mainstream discourse, we often talk about inherent or basic human rights and freedoms, as if they are inherent in the existence of every single person and can or should be exercised without interfering with others or being interfered with by others. However, this is in fact a myth. War in fact completely conceals right, and even natural right, to such an extent that right becomes unreal, abstract, and in a sense fictive. You will never discover any natural right. We either find only the war itself or inequalities that result from wars and violence. A freedom in which every individual is the equal of every other individual. This freedom-equality combination can, in reality, only be something that has no force and no content. The first criterion that defines freedom is the ability to deprive others of their freedom. What would be the point of being free, and what, in concrete terms, would it mean if one could not trample on the freedom of others? That is the primary expression of freedom. Freedom is the direct opposite of equality. It is something that is enjoyed thanks to difference, domination, and war, thanks to a whole system of relations of force. So essentially, there are no natural rights besides that acquired by the victorious party in conflict, and this is acquired via oppression of the losing party. There are also no natural freedoms besides whatever that is created by the victorious party. In fact, this is in close alignment with what I've been learning at university in political philosophy. So it's about a concept known as a claim right. So when I have a claim right, that say I have a right to X, then all other people have an obligation not to interfere with my right to X. Hence, this shows that rights cannot exist in a vacuum. when I have a right or freedom to something, it necessarily entails an infringement on others' rights or freedoms. Foucault notes, in the 17th and 18th centuries, we saw the emergence of techniques of power that were essentially centered on the body, on the individual body. They include all devices that were used to ensure the spatial distribution of individual bodies and the organization around those individuals of a whole field of visibility. Unlike discipline, which is addressed to bodies, the new non-disciplinary power is applied not to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as species. And examples of this sort of biopower exerted over people include a set of processes such as the ratio of births to deaths, the rate of reproduction, the fertility of a population, and so on. It is these processes, the birth rate, the mortality rate, longevity, and so on, together with a whole series of related economic and political problems, which in the second half of the 18th century become biopolitics' first objects of knowledge and the targets it seeks to control. There are also various campaigns to teach public hygiene, to implement healthcare, implement collective savings for pensions, and all sorts of life insurances. They're all with the aim of controlling the biological aspects of people's lives, like their health and their life expectancies. However, the most crucial domain of control exerted by biopolitics is its control over relationships between human races. What in fact is racism? It is primarily a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, the break between what must live and what must die. Racism makes it possible to establish a relationship between my life and the death of the other that is not a military or warlike relationship of confrontation, but a biological type relationship. The death of the bad race, of the inferior race, or the degenerate, or the abnormal, is something that will make life in general healthier and purer. And we can also understand why racism should have developed in modern societies that function in the biopower mode. We can understand why racism broke out at a number of privileged moments and why they were precisely the moments when the right to take life was imperative. Racism first develops with colonization, or in other words, with colonizing genocide. If you're functioning in the biopower mode, how can you justify the need to kill people, to kill populations, and to kill civilizations? By using the themes of evolution, by appealing to racism. In essence, for a society that has already moved into biopower mode, when it needs to draw on some sort of discourse to justify mass killings, racism is always the most convenient tool at hand. Once people have accepted that the state can control them as living organisms, they would naturally accept measures intended to make them better as a biological species. They simply do not question that. Hence, we can say that the shift to biopolitics has paved the way for the general acceptance of racist discourse. So here's a wrap on the key ideas that I wish to discuss from Foucault's lectures. I really enjoyed this collection of lectures. I think his ideas are quite enlightening and a refreshing difference from how I've always learned political philosophy. I think he examines power relations from a more practical and historically linked point of view rather than just engaging a lot with abstract philosophizing. I'm also definitely eager to explore a lot of his other works. So please like and subscribe if you like my video, and I would love to hear any comments on Foucault's ideas.